So I was talking about, during the meditation, I was mentioning a kind of grip in the core of the body. I'm wondering, did some of you have a sense of that as we were, maybe you can lift your hand as I ask a question and get a sense. This is very common. And frankly, it was many years before I was aware that I was holding a grip in this way, keeping a tight grip on myself, trying to stay in control in order not to what? Look like a fool, be rejected, not be loved. Can anyone relate to this? Hello. Right. Well, if you're a human being, you've probably experienced this at some time in your life. And we're afraid to lose control. We're afraid of the unknown. So afraid at times that we cling to our suffering because it's familiar. This is really interesting and surprising. At least it was for me as I began to do in-depth work with people, to see in some cases how attached they were to their suffering. Not because they wanted to suffer, but because of the familiarity of it. It was known. Kind of like a prisoner in their cell, after many years living in a little space, you kind of get used to it and you think, this is it, this is who I am. Kind of contracted and small and miserable as I take myself to be. And then someone kind of taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, turn around. Have you noticed that there's no wall in the back of your cell? It's just open space. And sometimes we don't want to look. We don't actually want to know that there is that much openness. Because to the conditioned mind, the unknown is threatening. Threatening to the loss of control. And one of the other interesting things that I noticed in my work with people is that we project onto the unknown all of our unfinished psychological baggage. Often from early childhood, from our wounds or deficits, what technically we call developmental trauma. So this vast, open, spacious field of awareness can look empty and isolated and terribly alone, if that's what we experienced growing up on some level. This is probably the most common flavor of the unknown, because abandonment, because of the fear of abandonment, we project that onto this openness, this unknown. But it can also sometimes appear as engulfing, annihilating, if that was our early experience. So something to be aware of in your own process as you open more to this spacious awareness, is this kind of resistance will arise. And it's wanting to be met with understanding and love. It's not about discarding it. It's actually about meeting it with tenderness, with insight. It's just innocent confusion. So I have found in my work with people, both my work as a depth psychotherapist in the last decade, my kind of more spiritual work, that this area, the area of the heart, and particularly the base of the spine, is the area, the greatest holding area. That is to say, area where we hold on our conscious and unconscious fear of annihilation. So it's a very dense area. And if we've had trauma, it's going to take some time and support, actually, from loving and attuned to others to help unwind this conditioning. And it helps tremendously to be in touch, to some degree, with presence. So this is not an easy subject. It's both complex and subtle and challenging to face our fear, to breathe into it without an agenda to change it, to embrace it lovingly, to inquire deeply, patiently. And something very interesting happens as we do, which is that we feel our ground opening, the sense of ground. And in this sense, I'll tilt my screen a little bit, but the ground is like a descent. We feel a sense of gravity almost, like our sense of identity drops lower and lower in the body. The hara means belly, Japanese. We feel something warming up, lighting up, and we feel ourselves inhabiting, actually, more deeply down into the lower belly. We feel more grounded, more stable, more here, right here, but in a very open, spacious way, not in a tightly contracted way, not in a trapped way, but in a free way. So the ground, we discover different dimensions of the ground in this process, in this exploration. And our sense of trust deepens. This is probably one of the most important qualities that unfolds in this exploration into the ground. As we move away from our constructed sense of ground, that which we stood on, that we thought was real, our separate self and all the stories and images that go with it, it can feel ungrounding sometimes if we've really been out of touch with what's real. And that can be a lot to tolerate. But gradually, we feel more grounded in silence, in stillness, in a dark mystery, if you will. And while initially it can feel like a descent, as I was describing, a kind of rootedness more and more deeply, perhaps into the earth and the body, it keeps opening. And you can't see my hand, but it's, let me again tip the screen. It's like it opens, it becomes less localized. We feel the ground all around us and as us. And something else interesting happens. We discover that this, call it ground of being, this dark stillness and silence, is full of life. Full of life. The Latin word is plenum, fullness. In this emptiness of story and image and all the reactive feelings and somatic contractions, in this willingness to empty out and be no thing, to release our familiar and constructed sense of ground, a new life, an essential aliveness emerges as a kind of upwelling. I mean, it doesn't have to be experienced that way, but often it is. It's as if there has been a hidden spring in the core of our being that was plugged. There was, I digress right now. I'm just remembering, there's a French film that I saw some years ago called, I think Manon, be Manon de la Source, Manon of the Spring. And there was a story about a spring that was hidden in France and then unplugged. So it's kind of like that. A hidden spring, a spring of essential aliveness. And it's not as if it all of a sudden opens, but as we deepen, as we surrender, as we trust, this is a point I was addressing before, as we trust more and more deeply, we open to this deep current of aliveness, which is very different than excitement, which is fine. It's very different than external stimulation. And as human beings, not only do we have this dimension of profound stillness and silence, but we have this tremendous creative spirit, this aliveness, and this capacity to love, which are expressions of this ground.